The envelope sat in the center of Mr. Aldridge's mahogany desk, like a small, quiet bomb. It had not been opened yet. The room smelled like old books and cold air conditioning. My wife, Vivian, sat to my left in a leather chair, her posture perfect, her silk blouse iron sharp. My sister Claudia sat along the far wall, arms folded, watching everything with careful eyes. Our family's estate attorney, Mr. Aldridge, sat across from us with his hands flat on the desk. Vivian's financial advisor, Preston, stood near the window, adjusting his watch every few minutes like the time actually mattered to him. Vivian squeezed my hand when she saw me look at the envelope. Her grip was warm, reassuring, almost tender. I did not squeeze back. I simply looked at her hand, then looked away. Everyone in that room expected one thing from the contents of that envelope. They had already rehearsed their reactions. The gentle exhale of relief, the grateful smiles, the congratulations. I could feel Vivian's confidence filling the room like perfume, strong, deliberate, suffocating. Mr. Aldridge cleared his throat and reached for it. I stopped him with 2 words, spoken quietly, without any emotion at all. "Read it aloud." Vivian's hand tightened just slightly, and the room went very, very still. 5 months earlier, Vivian had turned our 5th anniversary dinner into something none of our family would forget. We were at Rosario's, the restaurant where we had our first real date. The lighting was warm. The wine was cold. My Uncle Frederick and his wife, Aunt Dora, were there, my sister Claudia, a handful of close friends. We were raising a toast when Vivian clinked her glass and stood. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small white stick wrapped in a silk ribbon. She held it up with the kind of smile that silences a room. Everyone gasped. People clapped. My uncle shook my hand before I could even process what was happening. I sat there, stunned, a smile on my face that did not quite reach my eyes. Because through the noise and joy, one thought arrived sharp and fast. The trust fund. My grandfather's estate had a clause, a single condition for early release of funds, a verified biological heir before I turned 40. I was 36, and Vivian had just announced, in front of everyone we knew, that the heir had arrived. She looked at me across the table and said softly, "We should think about securing the baby's future right away, Nathan." I nodded. I smiled. I raised my glass. 2 days after the dinner, my sister Claudia came to the house while Vivian was at a prenatal appointment. Claudia sat at my kitchen counter with a mug of coffee she barely touched and looked at me the way she always had when she was about to say something I did not want to hear. She said I should request a paternity test. She was not cruel. She was careful, the way you are careful with someone you love. She reminded me that Vivian and I had gone through a rough stretch the previous year. Distance, arguments, a 3-week period in January when I'd been in Seattle for work, and we had barely spoken. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, I said I was not going to humiliate my wife over suspicion. If I had a real concern, I would handle my own way, quietly, and only when I had something solid. Claudia searched my face. She started to say something else, then stopped. Neither of us heard the soft creak of the hallway floorboard. Neither of us noticed a thin gap in the kitchen door where Vivian's shadow fell across the floor. Later, when Vivian came home and kissed my cheek, her eyes held something new, something that looked like calculation dressed carefully as relief. 3 weeks into February, the urgency shifted. Vivian began bringing up the trust fund in new ways. At breakfast, in the car, once, late at night, she placed a folder in my lap while I was reading. Inside were printed summaries of trust fund distribution options, early release procedures, and beneficiary forms. I looked at them slowly. Then I looked at her. She said she was thinking about the baby's education, about the future. It was framed perfectly as a mother's instinct. Protective, practical, completely reasonable. She had also, without mentioning it first, brought in Preston, a financial advisor she described as a family connection. He was smooth-voiced, calm, full of figures. He began joining our conversations about the estate as though he had always been part of them. But what stopped me cold happened on a Tuesday afternoon. I walked into my home office and found Vivian at my desk with a document open in front of her. She closed it quickly. Too quickly. The document was the original trust deed, something I had never shown her, never even mentioned, kept locked in my drawer for 6 years. I did not say a word. I simply walked to the window, looked outside, and filed that moment somewhere very deep inside myself. The crack appeared on a Wednesday. We were discussing the due date with Vivian's doctor, who confirmed the baby was due in the first week of October. Vivian was glowing, talking about nursery colors and name books. On the drive home, I did the math quietly in my head. An October due date meant conception in mid to late January. I thought about January carefully. I had left for Seattle on January 8th for a major work project. I did not return until January 29th, 3 full weeks. Vivian and I had spoken by phone only a handful of times during that stretch. She had told me she was staying at her mother's house upstate because she disliked being alone in the city. The dates did not work. It was not doubt. It was simple arithmetic. I did not show anything on my face when we pulled into the driveway. I helped her out of the car, told her the nursery could be sage green, and kissed her forehead. That night, after she fell asleep, I opened my laptop and pulled up my January records, hotel check-in dates, flight confirmations, receipts. I sat back and looked at the screen for a long time without moving. My Uncle Frederick hosted a Sunday brunch the following week. The kind my family called informal, but that always involved iron tablecloths and 3 courses. The pregnancy had become the main topic for any room Vivian walked into. But by the soup course, the mood shifted. My Aunt Dora asked Vivian very politely when exactly she had found out she was expecting. Vivian answered. My cousin Harlow, a labor and delivery nurse, paused mid-sentence and glanced at the ceiling. The way people do when calculating something they don't want to say aloud. My uncle, never good at reading a room, said bluntly that the timing seemed surprising given Nathan's travel schedule. The table went quiet. I watched Vivian's jaw tighten by the smallest fraction. Before anyone else could speak, I set my fork down and said clearly that Vivian and I were overjoyed, that the timing was our business, and that I hoped everyone would celebrate with us. The moment passed. People smiled. Later, near the dessert table, Vivian caught my eye across the room. She smiled, warm and grateful, and it lasted just a beat too long, her shoulders releasing in the slow exhale of someone who had narrowly avoided something serious. Vivian posted the announcement on the last day of February, a photograph of her hands cupped around tiny yellow booties. The caption read, "Our greatest adventure begins, growing our family and building our future, one heartbeat at a time." Hundreds of comments poured in. She responded in nearly all of them. 3 posts later, she shared a follow-up to her close friends list, a smaller audience she trusted. It was a softer post, more personal. In it, she wrote about finally securing our future and mentioned that the next few months would be the most important of our lives. She deleted it 2 hours later, but I had already seen it because I was logged into the shared kitchen tablet. I had taken a screenshot. I was still sitting with that screenshot open when my phone buzzed. A known number. No introduction. No explanation. Just an image attached. I stared at my screen for several seconds before the full weight of what I was looking at settled into my chest like cold water. I locked the phone, set it face down on the counter, poured myself a glass of water. My hand was completely steady. But inside, something had just shifted into a completely different gear. Quiet, purposeful, and impossible to stop. The image was a screenshot of an Instagram story. It showed Vivian at a rooftop party. String lights, a familiar skyline, champagne glasses raised. She was laughing, her arm around someone just out of frame. The date stamp read January 15th. I knew that date immediately. January 15th was a Tuesday. I was in Seattle, and Vivian had told me that same evening, on the phone, that she was at her mother's house upstate, that she was tired and had gone to bed early. I looked at her smile in the photo, open, bright, completely relaxed. Not the smile of someone home alone. I did not confront her. I made a phone call the next morning to a private medical laboratory I found through a colleague in corporate investigations. I explained what I needed. They explained the process. A DNA sample from me and a fetal sample obtained non-invasively through a maternal blood draw. Within 1 week, I had collected a hair sample from Vivian's nightstand brush and submitted my own sample separately. The lab confirmed receipt. Results would be ready in 6 to 8 weeks. I thanked them, hung up, and made dinner that evening as though nothing at all had happened. Because to Vivian, absolutely nothing had. March arrived with a new warmth in Vivian's behavior. She cooked on weeknights, left notes on my coffee cup. She was softer, more present than she had been in nearly a year. One evening she sat beside me on the back porch, rested her head on my shoulder, and said quietly, "I know this year has been hard, but you never doubted me. That means everything." I looked out the yard and said, "Of course." She curled closer and sighed deeply, the sigh of someone who feels truly safe. She believed, completely, that she had won, that my quietness was peace, that my patience was trust, that my steadiness meant I had no questions. She was reading the wrong book entirely. 2 days later, she told me she had scheduled a meeting with Mr. Aldridge for early May. She had already called his office. She wanted to begin activating the heir clause in the trust, get everything documented before the baby arrived. She said it made practical sense. I agreed. I said I would be there. She smiled and squeezed my arm. I smiled back and thought about the lab's timeline. 6 weeks remaining. The pace of this situation had never belonged to Vivian. She simply had not noticed yet. Mr. Aldridge's office in early May smelled like old leather and strong tea. He sat across from us in his usual chair, the trust deed open before him, reading glasses halfway down his nose. Vivian had brought Preston, who sat to her right with a slim notepad and an expensive pen. Mr. Aldridge walked us through the heir activation clause carefully, the way he explained everything, like translating a language only he fully understood. The clause was specific. A biological heir, verified by certified genetic testing, would trigger early release of the trust's principal fund. Preston made notes at the mere mention of the sum involved. Vivian leaned slightly forward as Mr. Aldridge described the timeline. Once verification was confirmed, funds could transfer within 3 to 4 weeks. Preston actually smiled at that. Vivian turned to look at me. I returned a calm, open expression I had been carefully preparing for weeks. Mr. Aldridge then noted, professionally, that standard procedure required certified genetic verification before any funds could move. Vivian's expression changed briefly. She said the process felt invasive for an unborn child and asked if there was another route. Mr. Aldridge said there was not. I said nothing at all and let the silence do its work. The morning after the attorney meeting, I drove to Mr. Aldridge's office alone. His assistant showed me in, and Mr. Aldridge was already at his desk with a second cup of tea. I told him I wanted to authorize the standard medical verification immediately through the certified laboratory the trust had used for estate matters in the past. I wanted it handled quietly, without additional discussion, with results sent directly to his office in a sealed envelope. He looked at me for a moment over the rim of his glasses. He asked no questions. He said, "I'll arrange it." On the drive home, I felt something I had not felt in months. Not relief, not anger, but control. The process was already moving in the direction I had chosen. Vivian believed the verification would confirm everything she needed. She did not know the private lab's results were already complete and waiting. She did not know I had coordinated both processes to ensure the certified chain of custody was airtight. She did not know that while she planned, I had already acted. She believed the pace of the situation was hers to control. It never had been. Not from the night she stood up at that anniversary dinner and changed everything. The last week of May, Vivian had 3 of her closest friends over for an afternoon that stretched well into evening. I worked from my home office with the door cracked. The conversation drifted to me through the walls in pieces. Vivian spoke about nursery plans, names, a trip before the baby arrived. Then her voice dropped, not to a whisper, but to the comfortable low register of someone speaking among trusted allies. I heard the word trust. I heard the phrase essentially sorted. I heard Preston's name mentioned as someone already working on an investment structure. They were not speaking about possibilities. They were speaking about certainties. The trust was being discussed as though it were already distributed, already spent. That same afternoon, a notification arrived on my phone from the private laboratory. For words, results are ready. Call us. I put the phone in my pocket. I walked downstairs, made a round of drinks for Vivian and her friends, smiled warmly, and exchanged small talk for 10 minutes. Then I went back to my office, closed the door quietly behind me, and dialed the laboratory. The voice on the other end was professional and steady. I listened. I thanked them. Then I sat very still for a moment before opening my laptop. Mr. Aldridge called us in on the second Friday of June. The setting was more formal than our previous visits. He had requested that key parties be present: Vivian, me, Claudia, Preston, and a representative from the Trust Administration Office, a quiet, precise woman named Constance who had worked in estate law for 30 years. Vivian wore a navy dress and carried herself with the energy of someone arriving at a long-anticipated ceremony. She greeted Constance warmly. She asked Preston in a low voice if everything was still on schedule. He nodded once. I sat in my usual chair. I had brought one item, a slim folder placed face down on my knee. Mr. Aldridge opened the meeting by explaining that the certified genetic report, processed through the Trust's verified laboratory partner with full chain of custody documentation, had been received by his office that morning. He noted for the record that sample collection had been properly conducted and that the integrity of the results was legally beyond question. Vivian crossed her legs and folded her hands in her lap, composed, calm. She reached across and took my hand, just as she had months before in the same room. I let her hold it. Constance uncapped her pen. Mr. Aldridge picked up the envelope and broke the seal. The room held its breath. Mr. Aldridge unfolded the single page slowly. He adjusted his glasses. He read silently for a moment, just a few seconds, and in those seconds I watched Vivian's face. It was perfectly still, the way a face looks when it has been rehearsed many times. Mr. Aldridge set the paper flat on his desk and read aloud in his steady, neutral voice. Probability of paternity, 0%. No one moved. The word sat in the center of the room, like a stone dropped into still water. Preston's pen stopped. Constance looked up from her notepad. Claudia, across the room, exhaled slowly through her nose. I kept my eyes on the desk. I did not look at Vivian. I heard the sound of her breath change. A small, barely audible catch, like someone stepping onto ice and feeling it shift beneath them. Then she spoke. Her voice was measured, but something was cracking underneath it. She said the test must be wrong. She said it was a lab error. She said she wanted it redone immediately. She said it with the same confidence she had carried into that room. But for the first time, that confidence had no floor beneath it. The clock above Mr. Aldridge's bookshelf ticked softly into the silence that followed. Mr. Aldridge waited for Vivian to finish. He did not rush. He did not interrupt. When she went quiet, he spoke with the same neutral steadiness he had used to read the result. He explained that sample collection had been overseen by a certified medical professional. The laboratory was the same firm the Trust had used for 15 years, with a zero error rate in contested estate matters. The chain of custody documentation was complete, witnessed, and dated. He used the phrase legally unimpeachable. Then he explained that under the trust deed, any early distribution request unsupported by verified biological confirmation was automatically suspended, effective immediately, with no appeals process outside of court. Constance made a note. Preston put his pen in his jacket pocket. Vivian's eyes moved to me, really moved, as though seeing me clearly for the first time in months. She looked for the patient version of me, the protector, the man who would absorb anything quietly. Then I said, calmly and without raising my voice, I anticipated this might be the outcome. The room shifted around those 9 words, and everyone present understood that I had not, for a single moment, been caught off guard. I opened the folder I had kept face down on my knee throughout the meeting. I placed it on Mr. Aldridge's desk and turned it so Constance could see clearly. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a printout of my January travel records. Hotel check-in on January 8th in Seattle. Check-out on January 29th. The second was a flight manifest showing both dates. The third was a one-page timeline I had prepared, mapping the medically confirmed conception window for an early October due date, mid to late January, directly against my documented absence. The math was visible, clean, undeniable. I explained that 6 weeks prior, I had also contacted the Trust's discretionary account administrator and requested a temporary freeze on all discretionary access, pending formal verification. Constance confirmed this with a single nod. She had the freeze documentation in her own file. Preston looked at that last detail and said nothing. The investment plans, the quiet conversations about financial structure, the certainty Vivian had displayed in front of her friends just weeks before, all of it had been built on access that had been frozen before anyone ever sat down in this room. The money had never been within reach. It had never moved an inch toward them. Claudia had not spoken since Mr. Aldridge read the result. She sat along the wall with her arms no longer crossed, her hands open on her knees. When the silence after my presentation settled, she looked at me, not with triumph, not with pity, with something quieter, the expression of someone watching a person they love be seen clearly by a room that had underestimated them. She gave me one slow nod. I returned it. That was all. Preston gathered his notepad and stood. He said he needed to make some calls. He did not say to whom. He did not make eye contact with Vivian as he left. Constance finished her notes, capped her pen, and said the trust suspension would be formally documented and sent to all registered parties within 5 business days. Through all of it, Vivian sat completely still. She had arrived in that room as the most prepared person at the table. Now the room had rearranged itself around a different truth entirely. She looked at me and I could see her searching, looking for the old Nathan, the patient one, the man who absorbed anything quietly and smoothed it over afterward. She opened her mouth to speak. I said simply, quietly, "Give it a moment." And I meant it. What followed was something I had expected, but still found difficult to observe. Vivian's composure broke in stages, like ice cracking from the edges inward. First came the quiet explanation. She said there must be a mistake, that the pregnancy had brought enormous stress, that stress could cause confusion. Then the tears. Real ones, I believed, though I could not be certain where genuine grief ended and strategy began. Her voice shook when she said she had not meant for things to happen this way, that she had made a terrible mistake, that it did not change what we had built. I sat with all of it without leaning toward her or away. When she finished, I said very quietly, "I know about January 15th. She froze. The tears stopped. I watched the change move across her face, the shift from sorrow to something colder and more alert. "Someone sent me a photograph." I said, "You were at a rooftop party in the city. That evening, you told me by phone you were at your mother's house upstate, that you had gone to bed early." I paused. I kept the message. She did not respond. She did not offer a single word, and that silence told me everything her tears had carefully withheld. I placed one final item on Mr. Aldridge's desk, a printed document, not from my own files, but from a record search my attorney had conducted quietly over the previous 2 weeks. It showed that Vivian had visited a separate state attorney, a firm across the city, in late February, just days after the family brunch where my uncle had questioned the timeline. The consultation had focused on spousal inheritance rights, trust fund beneficiary law, and the legal standing of an unborn child in estate proceedings. She had not mentioned it to me. She had not mentioned it to Mr. Aldridge. She had gone alone and asked detailed questions about what would happen to the trust if the marriage ended, and what would happen if the heir clause was successfully triggered first. The pattern was now fully visible to everyone in the room. This was not poor judgment born from fear. It was a sequence of deliberate decisions, each one building on the last, designed to move money from one place to another before I could understand what was happening. Preston looked at the document. He said nothing. He closed his notepad and left the room without looking at Vivian once. Her silence had outlasted every other option, and in that room, silence had become its own kind of confession. Constance remained after Preston left, and after Claudia quietly excused herself to the hallway. She was professional and precise as she explained what followed from the trust's perspective. The attempted misrepresentation, submitting a paternity claim that could not be verified, was now formally documented in the trust record. It would not disappear. Any future legal challenge to the trust would encounter that documentation as a permanent part of the file. The early distribution clause had not merely been suspended. It had been nullified by the circumstances of its activation attempt. Vivian's attorney would receive written notification within the week. 3 days later, I met with my own attorney, a direct, sharp woman named Adiz, highly recommended by a colleague. I walked her through everything without emotion. She listened carefully, asked 2 questions, and told me we had an extremely clean case. I authorized her to begin divorce proceedings that afternoon. She asked whether I want to pursue additional legal action regarding the attempted trust fraud. I told her I would let the trust administrators determine what fell within their authority. I was not interested in punishment. I was interested in closing a door cleanly, completely, and permanently, and then walking through a different one. The social fallout came quietly, but it came completely. Vivian's friends, the same women who had sat in our living room weeks before, speaking about the trust in the tone of a settled matter, began to withdraw one by one. A few sent brief, awkward messages expressing surprise. One stopped responding entirely. The warm congratulations that had surrounded the pregnancy announcement went cold in pieces. The way a fire goes out, not all at once, but gradually, until there is nothing left but ash. Preston sent a formal letter stating he was no longer in a position to represent Vivian's financial interests. It was professional and said very little. I heard through Claudia that he had contacted Mr. Aldridge separately to ensure his name was clearly distanced from the proceedings. The apartment felt different after that week. Not louder. Quieter, actually. But the quiet had a new texture. Before, the silence in our home had always felt like something being held back, a room full of breath that was never quite exhaled. Now the silence was simply space. Empty, honest, and waiting to be filled with something real. Vivian moved out in the first week of July. She did not ask me for anything. I did not offer anything. And that, in its own way, said everything. The night she left, I sat in the dark living room for a long time. The apartment settled around me. The refrigerator hum, the street below, the quiet sound of the building at rest. I did not feel what I had expected. There was no rage, no clean wave of relief. What I felt was grief. Not for Vivian, not for the version of us I had once believed in. I grieved the years I had spent waiting to be trusted, while choosing to give trust in its place. The two are not the same thing. Somewhere in that difference, I had lost pieces of myself I could not easily name. I sat with that. I did not fight it. I let it be what it was, the way you let rain be rain, not because you enjoy it, but because it is real. Then, slowly, something else arrived. Not sudden, not dramatic. A quiet, clear thought that rose up through the grief. The trust fund, my grandfather's work, his intentions, had almost been turned into a weapon against me. And I understood, in that dark room, that I had the power to decide what it became. I could choose its meaning now. I sat with that thought until the room around me felt completely, entirely different. 2 weeks later, I called Mr. Aldridge and Constance into a meeting, just the 3 of us. I wanted to restructure the trust, not to access it early, not to redirect it toward myself. I wanted to rewrite the purpose of its early release clause entirely. My grandfather, Elias Archer, had built that clause around legacy, a biological heir as proof of continuation. I told Mr. Aldridge I understood his intention, and that I wanted to expand what legacy meant. Working with Constance, we drafted a restructuring proposal. A portion of the trust's annual earnings would be allocated to a scholarship fund for first-generation university students in our city. The fund would carry my grandfather's name. He had been the first in his family to finish secondary school. The scholarship would honor where he started, not where he arrived. I did not announce this publicly. I did not post about it anywhere. I signed the documents, shook Mr. Aldridge's hand, and drove home. The restructuring was pending board approval. About 30 days, Constance estimated. I told her there was no rush. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I was not in a hurry for anything. 3 months later, my Uncle Frederick hosted his autumn gathering. The kind of long afternoon that always involved too much food and conversations circling back to themselves. I arrived alone. Claudia was already there, helping Aunt Dora in the kitchen. The house was warm and genuinely noisy, the sound of people comfortable with each other. My cousin Harlow asked how I was, and I told her honestly that I was well. She nodded and did not press, which I appreciated. My uncle found me near the fireplace before dinner. He wrapped one arm around my shoulders, the closest he was ever going to come to an apology, and said quietly that I had handled everything with more grace than most men would manage. I told him I had simply tried to stay calm and see clearly. He said that was harder than it sounded. I agreed. At the table, I spoke less than most and listened more. But something had shifted in how people looked at me. Not with curiosity about what had happened, not with pity, with the specific kind of respect that comes from watching someone choose dignity when the situation offered every excuse not to. I was not broken. I was not performing strength. I was, for the first time in years, simply and completely myself. People ask what I learned. They want a clean answer, a lesson that fits into one sentence. I understand the impulse. The truth is more layered than that. I learned that kindness without awareness is not kindness. It is an open door. I learned that choosing not to react is not the same as choosing not to see. I can do both at once. See clearly and still choose calm. I learned that the quietest person in a room is not the least informed. And I learned that real trust is not something you give out of fear. It is something built through consistency, through honesty, the same way whether anyone is watching or not. The genetic report ended the lie in one line. Clinical, absolute, but my clarity did not begin in that attorney's office. It began the night I sat alone at my laptop, looking at travel records, and made a quiet decision to see things as they actually were, not as I had hoped. I did not lose a wife that June. I lost an illusion I had been maintaining at great cost for far too long. And in its place, I found something I had not held in years. Myself, quiet, steady, and finally completely free.